Hi, everyone. Today we have Magnolia Perron with us. Magnolia is the Director of Strategy and Partnerships at NACCA, and she came through Indigenous policy and nationhood studies before moving into the finance side, and she's represented Canada as a civil society delegate at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Magnolia, welcome, and please take us into your world for a minute. How would you describe what you actually do?
Thanks so much for having me. Um, my name's Magnolia Perron. I'm a proud member of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, which is a First Nation community located in Ontario. The name of my community is Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. I do live and work in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and that's where the organization I work for, NACCA, is headquartered. So NACCA is the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. We are a national nonprofit Indigenous organization here in Canada, and we represent a network of over 50 Indigenous financial institutions across Canada. Our members, the Indigenous financial institutions, work with Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs in Canada to provide business loans, grants, advisory services, and other workshops and capacity training to help support entrepreneurs to start and grow their businesses.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think that was a really good short description of NACA and would help explain exactly what they're doing. So, could you tell me a little bit more about the network of Indigenous financial institution? How exactly NACA helps them, and what has actually, let me move to this question. What has the network actually changed for these Indigenous entrepreneurs and the communities over the last few years? How would you say the impact has been?
Yeah, thanks for that question. NACA is actually celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. So we've been around for the last 30 years, and really our role is to act as that unified voice for the 50 plus Indigenous financial institutions across the country. And we really have a few key mandates. First is around advocacy. So we do a lot of work with the federal government to advocate on behalf of the Indigenous financial institutions, but also just Indigenous business development in Canada more broadly. Secondly, we administer various programs on behalf of the federal government, which are delivered by our members. So our core program is our Indigenous Entrepreneurship Program, but we also then have programs that we've launched over the last few years related to specific groups and demographics. So we have an Indigenous Women Entrepreneurship Program, which includes a microloan fund. We just launched a youth program as well to support younger entrepreneurs to get into entrepreneurship and to access capital. And then the third, I guess, pillar for NACA is really around capacity building. So we do a lot of training and skills development with both management, but also uh, loans officers, business development officers that are working within our member organization. So that's a little bit around how we support our membership. What's unique about Indigenous financial institutions, they are Indigenous owned and controlled. So what that means is that their board of directors, their governance is made up of members of the communities they serve, and also they're community based. So they're actually located in the Indigenous communities where they provide their services, which means they have very close relationships and they understand the needs of their communities quite well. And the Indigenous financial institutions were created back in the 1980s because conventional lending systems, uh, to be frank, weren't designed around Indigenous realities. Many Indigenous people, especially those located on a First Nation or reserve, often wouldn't be able to access a loan through a traditional bank or mainstream lender because of systematic barriers with legislation. So in Canada, we have something called the Indian Act, which impacts First Nations in Canada. And there's restrictions in there, such as Section 89, that don't allow First Nations to use their property as collateral, for example. So this limits their ability to go to a bank and access a loan for their business. So our Indigenous financial institutions were created to fill that gap. And so they do that by combining financing with business support, coaching, mentorship, and really just being like that trusted business support that entrepreneurs can go to. So, over the years, our Indigenous financial institutions collectively have supported over 53,000 loans going out to Indigenous businesses across the country. So, and the demand is just, higher
Yeah.
than we can meet at this point. So, really, our network is just helping Indigenous entrepreneurs launch businesses and scale and grow their businesses and really strengthening the local economies.
Thank you so much for that. I think that explains pretty well exactly what NACCA is, how that's operating, and but tell me about the results. How do you if is there any particular result, whether it be a single business or community, that captures what the network does better than the aggregate numbers do, or
Yeah, for sure. Like I can give an example. So we just released our latest annual report. So in 2024 to 2025, we had 176 million new loans issued out to entrepreneurs, which is great. We're quite happy with that. But I think one of the stats that really speaks to our success is our repayment rate. We have a 95% repayment rate. So we don't have, significant loan write-offs or loan losses in our portfolio because I think our Indigenous financial institutions do their due diligence to ensure, the businesses are viable and that, they're going to be successful. But I think more importantly, they build relationships with their clients. So unlike maybe, traditional banks or mainstream financial institutions where they hand you the loan and they say, okay, well, we'll see you when you need to start making repayments. Our IFIs maintain very close relationships with their clients, checking in on them, visiting them at their place of business. So it's really relational in the way that we do our business. And
Mhm.
also in Indigenous communities and Indigenous cultures, broadly speaking, reciprocity is a big value. And so I think our businesses that we support understand if they don't repay that loan, that means that someone else in their community might not be able to access a loan in the future to support their business needs. So there's also, I think, the accountability on behalf of the clients to want to repay that so that that money can be recycled and loaned out to other community members who are looking to either grow or launch a business. So I think, those are some of the stats that I'm really proud of. One of the others is probably related to our lending going to Indigenous women entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
So a big part of my role when I came into the organization was helping to implement and roll out an initiative to support more Indigenous women to access capital, but also to participate in entrepreneurship in Canada. And so before we launched our program in 2022, our lending across our network to Indigenous women was around 28%. So those were, of all the loans we were doing on a given year, 28% were either 100% owned by Indigenous women or partially owned by Indigenous women.
Mm.
We launched our Indigenous Women Entrepreneurship Program, which included a new loan fund, a microloan fund, to support women starting maybe smaller uh, micro businesses, maybe home based or part time, for example, as well as just promoting access to our other financial products. And now our lending at the end of our last reporting period has increased to 38.8%. So we're definitely seeing the difference it makes when you invest in, tailored programs that really address some of the unique barriers that Indigenous women face. And more interestingly, we found that when we looked at loans that were going to new businesses, women now make up over 50% of those loans. So we know the Indigenous Women Entrepreneurship Program that we launched is really helping to kickstart women to launch and build businesses. So we're really excited and really proud of that stat. And I think compared to, mainstream non-Indigenous women entrepreneurs in Canada, like we know that Indigenous women are getting into entrepreneurship at a higher rate, and the number is growing quite high. So, the fact that we're able to keep up with that in our results of lending going towards Indigenous women is really significant. Of course, there's always room for improvement and room to grow and continue to innovate in that space. But those are some of the things I think in terms of like results and impacts that I'm quite proud of.
So, sorry, go on, Ahmed.
Yeah, so on this new program that you guys launched, so was it only just the financial instruments that kind of helped increase the adoption and the the success of this program, or was it some other stuff as well, like capacity building, advisory?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It definitely was a combination of multiple efforts. The program itself that we designed, first off, was designed in consultation with Indigenous women entrepreneurs. So it was really important at the onset, if we're going to build a program, we need to hear from women directly about what they need and what they want to see. But secondly, we recognize that, yes, access to capital is the top challenge that Indigenous women are facing when trying to start their business. However, we also know access to training and information and resources is another barrier due to whether it's childcare, transportation. We also know, broadband internet can be a challenge, and especially in more remote or northern communities where many Indigenous communities are located. So we recognized if we were going to build a program, it needed to be holistic. So yes, there was capitalizing a microloan fund, because before that, most of our Indigenous financial institutions didn't have a microfinance product. As you may know, often microloans are considered higher risk. They often, cost the same to administer. So the fact that we were able to offset that risk by providing the funding made it more appealing to IFIs, and then enabled them to support women that had these home-based or part-time businesses, as I mentioned, but then also building out curriculum and training on entrepreneurship, on financial literacy, on marketing, so that we could also build the skills of their clients was really important. And we did an evaluation in 2024 and found that there was a lot of upfront work that needed to happen in terms of training and capacity building to enable Indigenous women to take that next step to launch their business or to apply for a loan. And I think it comes back to confidence. We know, often when there's training and resources in our communities, it's often Indigenous women that are, registering and wanting to sign up to participate. And so it was providing them with the tools and information to feel empowered to start their business. But on the other side of things, for our Indigenous financial institutions, we also provide training and capacity. So through the program, our members could hire dedicated business support officers to work with women clients. So part of what we've done through the program is training those business support officers on, business plan assessment, cash flow planning, due diligence, like all sort of different areas, so that those individuals who are then supporting the entrepreneurs have the right skills and information to deliver the program successfully. And then lastly, we also developed training using the GBA Plus framework, gender-based analysis tool, so that we could work with our members to talk about the importance of equity in our programs and really think about how some of the existing policies, programs, and procedures may put women at a disadvantage, and how can we be aware of our own internal bias when we are working with female clients as well. So it was definitely different layers and approaches we took to roll out this program and get buy-in from our members as well.
That sounds like a really complicated problem to solve. And does region also play a part in that in terms of how that training or how those programs are structured? Because I imagine going from British Columbia to Quebec, so many, IFIs in between and so many different um, groups of people. Like, how does that add to the complexity of how you're trying to deliver maybe like a streamlined or a consistent product?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that's, I think, also what makes NACCA a bit unique. While we, do develop programs and initiatives and they're standardized to some degree, there is also a lot of room for flexibility and customization. So we really look to our members to be those regional experts. And so even within the training curriculum and resources, they're encouraged and empowered to modify so that it's reflecting the realities of the regions they serve or the Indigenous nations within their catchment area. Because you're right, it is really different across Canada, and it would be very difficult for NACCA to develop one product that is going to resonate with Indigenous women across the country, because there is so much diversity even within the Indigenous communities in Canada. We have over 630 individual First Nation communities in our country. So yeah, we have to recognize the diversity. But NACCA, from our head office in Ottawa, we can't be an expert in those regional and cultural differences. So we really rely on our members to bring that perspective into the programming and curriculum.
Interesting. I want to ask a little bit about, there's a fact that I read that Indigenous women are starting businesses faster than almost any other group in Canada right now. What do you think is driving that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I definitely know there's been a lot of effort, certainly at NACCA, but among other organizations in the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Canada, and even the federal government has had a women entrepreneurship strategy in place since 2018. So I think there's been a lot of concerted effort in promoting women entrepreneurship broadly in Canada. And with that, a lot more unique programming, financing options, training programs, and so on. But also, I know at NACCA, like, we've really invested in the marketing and storytelling. So promoting stories of Indigenous women in business who have built, successful companies in different industries. So, I think there's a lot of power in sharing those stories in multiple ways. I think, it can break down sometimes, stigma or bias that exists in maybe the mainstream society around Indigenous people, to say, hey, like, we're actually contributing to the economy. We're building really great businesses. But more importantly, they serve as a source of, I think, inspiration for young people in our communities to see entrepreneurship as a potential pathway. It's really that idea is, if I see someone who maybe comes from a similar background as me succeeding in a certain industry, it makes me think like, well, if they can do it, maybe I can too. So I think, that's part of it. Interestingly, we do see like a lot of the women that we're supporting through our program, many are starting entrepreneurship, maybe more middle age. So a lot of them have, maybe their childcare responsibilities are not at the forefront. They have had a successful career and are now, making that pivot or transition into entrepreneurship. So it's really interesting. I would say about a little bit over half of the clients through our program are probably more in that age range, but also a lot of the young people we're seeing get into entrepreneurship are also women. I think in general, like in Canada, if you look at even like education rates and stuff like that, Indigenous women have higher education enrollment and graduation rates, for example. So I think a lot of the people too that we see getting into entrepreneurship are coming with some sort of, post-secondary education. And yeah, so I think those might be some of the reasons. And lastly, there's just a lot of need in our community. So I think a lot of the businesses that we see across Indigenous entrepreneurs, this isn't women specific, but often their businesses are created because there's a gap or an unfulfilled need in their community. And so they kind of are just like, hey, well, I'm going to step up and do something about it and create a business to address that. So that may also play a role too. So yeah, it is really interesting and it's exciting to see.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you a question about your experience representing Canada as a civil society delegate at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. What did you find yourself explaining to that room about how Indigenous women access capital or cannot? How was that experience for you personally?
Yeah, thank you. It was really a humbling experience, and I definitely felt really honored to have the opportunity to participate as a civil society organization delegate on behalf of NACCA, along with Women and Gender Equality Canada, and also speak at Canada's official side event there and share the work that NACCA is doing on a international level with an international audience. And I think generally, like, what I shared is very similar to some of the stuff we've been talking about already. Of course, sharing about some of the success that we've had in the program, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Sure.
We've had pockets of funding to support this program, but of course, we're seeking long-term investment to ensure the sustainability of the program and of initiatives like this. And I also talked a lot about some of the more maybe social impacts of the program. That the numbers are great, and often people are really interested in like, what are the economic impacts? And we've it's been about 4 years that we've had this program. We've done about over 600 microloans valued at $11 million. So we're proud. We're really excited about that. But I think when we look at some of the social impacts, and we did an evaluation in 2024, and some of the women that we interviewed and surveyed had reported, increased quality of life, improved, socioeconomic conditions, whether that's, better housing, not being in a food insecure position, and things like that. So it's like those sort of social indicators are really powerful. And also we know, like, violence against women, we know that economic self-sufficiency can help women escape those sorts of situations. So I think on the social indicator side, there's a lot more we can do. We've started to collect, some data and do some research on that, but I think these programs it's important to look at both economic and social indicators and how they're impacting the lives of the women and their families that are accessing the program. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Emma, do you have any question at this point before?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know an example of where, we're constantly talking about the economic aspects of investing versus the social and development aspects of it. Would you happen to have an example where maybe the economic side of a particular investment did not work out, but the social side would make you, or justify that investment 10 times over?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, generally, I would say, like, most of the clients we've supported through NACCA programs widely. As I mentioned, we have a really high repayment rate. The businesses we're supporting are doing well. We have a lot of returning clients as well that come back a second, third, or fourth time as they're building and growing on their business. But of course, I think in general, in my conversations with entrepreneurs, like, there's always going to be failures that happen, and those are like pivotal moments for just learning and pivoting and trying something different. And we actually find that when we're putting on workshops or bringing entrepreneurs together at different events or conferences and stuff like that, it's those stories of failure that help other entrepreneurs avoid the same mistakes. And I think there's a lot of power in talking about some of those things. So that's maybe how I would respond to that, more on a like individual business or entrepreneur level. I would say on the programming side, in terms of investments, we've tried, like, when we first were developing the Indigenous Women Entrepreneurship Program, and I go back to that because it's a program I was deeply involved in terms of the design and development. We tried to create a mentorship program, and we found at the end of the day, uptake across our members was lower than what we expected. Those that did participate, the mentees or the clients that went through that program reported an excellent experience and really enjoyed that aspect of the program. But we found overall that, like, our members, they're financial institutions, and their focus really is on lending, and to run and implement a mentorship program takes a lot of capacity and resources. And so there was a bit of maybe a mismatch that happened there. But we were able to redirect that program to a new entity that NACCA helped establish, which is the Indigenous Prosperity Foundation, which was created to really support early stage entrepreneurs. So maybe those that are just getting started, they're not quite ready to access capital through our Indigenous financial institutions. So they're doing a lot more on like capacity building through financial literacy, digital literacy. They have a focus on mentorship as well. So we were able to kind of redirect that program to an entity that could then actually work with IFI clients to provide that mentorship and take on that administrative workload. So yeah, these are just maybe some examples of like where we've had to pivot and, you know, we've tried something and realized maybe it wasn't the best fit and had to adjust the programming to realign.
Okay. I've one question. Sorry, Ahmed, but pulling the camera back a little, you know, the Canadian bank sector is very consolidated, and given the success that NACCA's had over the last 30 years or so, do you see traditional banks or big banks now paying attention to the indigenous economy?
Definitely. I think, you know, in Canada over, you know, the last 10 plus years, there's been a big focus on Indigenous reconciliation. I think it was in 2015 when we came out with the report for truth and reconciliation. With that came a number of calls to action for different institutions in industries, including the financial sector. And so I think a lot of organizations, government, private sector have been looking at ways that they can play a role in reconciliation. And oftentimes it's economic reconciliation. So I think for banks and financial institutions in Canada, there's definitely been more interest to want to support Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs. And I think many of the big banks in Canada have actually created specific financial products and initiatives to try to attract more Indigenous businesses and address maybe some of those barriers that exist, which is great. I mean, I think it's good for our entrepreneurs and businesses to have more options on where they can go. But often we find like NACCA and our Indigenous financial institutions are more accessible to Indigenous entrepreneurs, and also Indigenous entrepreneurs often report a good experience working with an Indigenous financial institution because there's a shared understanding of their history and of their culture, and so that, you know, it makes it a more seamless, positive experience for our members. And as I mentioned earlier, it's more relational, and so it's a little bit different than how some of the banks operate. But there's definitely been more interest in demand in the space.
Perfect. Thank you so much for explaining everything around the network and NACCA and the amazing work that you've done, especially around Indigenous women entrepreneurs and promoting that. Let's talk a little bit about, you know, emerging technologies and AI in your world, and, you know, how would you say it's something relevant to how Mark was, operating as well, but how would you say, where do you think AI conversation is most overhyped when it comes to running programs like yours, and where is it underhyped, or where is it more useful?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I definitely, um, there's a lot of buzz around AI right now, everywhere. Certainly within, my world, working within, Indigenous economic development and working closely with um, our members and different entrepreneurs. I think for us, we don't want Indigenous peoples or Indigenous entrepreneurs or businesses to be left behind. So ensuring that our community has access to training, information, tools, internet connectivity, these are really important so that we can keep up with everyone else and have the same benefit of leveraging those tools. And at the same time, I think there is a need for training and education on how to engage with these tools in a good way. And I think definitely from an Indigenous perspective and working for an Indigenous organization, data sovereignty is always really important. So how do we, protect our data when we're interacting with these tools and technologies? So I think, it's important that we're using and benefiting from them, but at the same time, we have to be careful with what information we're sharing, um, so that it's not, impacting us in a negative way in the future too.
Yeah.
So I think, it's an evolving space, but certainly for us, it's about, promoting, closing the digital divide that we see in Canada, uh, when it comes to access to technology connectivity for Indigenous communities, and ensuring we're providing, like I said, the right training, information, and tools, so that they can benefit as well. But I will say we have a business hub in Ottawa
Mhm.
that's open to Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses. And anytime we, host any sort of workshop or training around, using AI or how to use ChatGPT, for your business, there's a lot of interest among our community to want to learn and to engage. And, you'll always have people within any space that have, differing opinions, um, on what best practice looks like, but there's definitely, I would say, a lot of interest in our community to want to learn and benefit from those tools.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. And I think that's the general approach that we are seeing elsewhere as well, that, you have to mitigate the risk around it. You have to make sure it's being used appropriately and in order to, achieve certain outcomes for your business rather than a complete blowout of AI on everything. And Emma, do you have any questions on this topic? Just wanted to make sure before I move on.
I mean, I think not a question, but a comment here is now with AI, I think you can really get to customize and localize your the big products that you use every day. So, if you, for example, you're using a very expensive subscription for like a CRM or an invoicing tool, you always feel like there's things on this that are missing that don't solve my exact use case. And I feel like AI is definitely bridging that gap. And that's what I'm seeing across various industries where people are like, I shouldn't be paying for this subscription. Maybe I should be going for my own custom tool because now it's not going to be that much more expensive or that much more further away than, having a customization in. So that's a really interesting dynamic that I see, and I kind of get why so many businesses are excited and so happy about using AI.
Would say for sure, like within our organization and even with our Indigenous financial institutions, our members, like there's tremendous potential to reduce administrative burden on our team. So, they can spend more time, on the things that matter. I think, like also for our Indigenous financial institutions, we don't want them to fall behind in the latest technology. Some financial institutions, you can apply for a loan, within under 5 minutes sort of thing on an online application tool. So how can we also leverage different tools and technology so that our members are able to compete with others in the industry? And I think at the end of the day, like technology is great, but it will never replace that human interaction and relationship. And I think within the Indigenous finance sector and for NACCA and our members, the relationships are our greatest strength. And so, honoring that relationship and trust we've built with our clients, we can't let, technology or AI replace that.
So where would you draw the line between, given that relationship is the most important aspect your in your world, but also in most of the services industries, that is, that's everything, and context is everything. So where would you draw the line between automating an application and losing the human part of it when
It's
it
a good
comes to it?
question. I don't think I have the answer to that, but I guess, I would say, building off of what I mentioned earlier, I think reducing some of those administrative tasks, great, excellent. But I know, many of our entrepreneurs want that face time with another person to talk through their idea, get business advice or guidance, ask questions. So I think like there's certain elements where face to face is going to be the best way to convey that information, versus, through some kind of automated response. So I think, yeah, it's a balancing act. I think it's great if it can help reduce some of the administrative workload,
Mm-hmm.
but also, not taking away from that face-to-face time that happens between a loans officer or business development officer and the client, because that trust enables more, open communication and accountability. So, if something, and this is something we've found with our network, if an entrepreneur, a client is, in trouble, facing a hardship, the fact that they have such a good relationship with their loans officer or business development officer, they feel comfortable to pick up the phone and let them know early so that the IFI, the Indigenous Financial Institution, can then come up with a mediation plan to support the entrepreneur through that. Maybe it's pausing payments for a couple months, so on and so forth, depending on the situation. But, those are the types of things, if we lose that relationship and lose that trust, where it could be really risky for organizations.
Understood. Conscious of time, I'm just going to try and wrap it up now, but if you could give me one principle, if you could get one principle across to every business support officer working with founders right now, what would it be?
One piece of advice, I guess, for me, I would say probably really getting to know the founder and again, it comes back to relationships, like building that shared understanding of what their visions, their goals are, um, helping to be that like sounding board to bounce ideas off of, you know, celebrating their wins, being there when there are those hardships that come up. So it really, to me, just comes back to, you know, building a solid relationship with the founders that you're working with. And yeah, just continuing to nourish that relationship into the future. So I think that's what I would offer.
Great. Emmett, just want to make sure you don't have anything on your mind to
No,
ask.
all good, all good. Great advice, by the way.
Thank you so much, Magnolia. That was a very useful 45 minutes, and I, for one, took a lot from it. Um, we should let you get on with your day. Thank you so much for coming on and being so generous and transparent with the detail that you've given us today around NACCA, the programs that you've run, and all the great work that you've been doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really an honor to be here to share a little bit about myself and the work that we do at NACCA to support and uplift Indigenous entrepreneurs in Canada, and look forward to the opportunity to speak again. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.